have the Ayatollah of fantasy rock and roller with us today, Adam Rank. How you doing, Rank?
They look great in person, and I just can't wait to next year where we can pack it full of 25,000.
Hey, Bob, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. I didn't know it was Ball Guys Day. It was me and Rank. I mean, how can you lose?
This is the Dynasty Vipers ViperCast.
Welcome to the Dynasty Vipers ViperCast. We have a little bit of a morning special. Make sure you got your coffee. Find your favorite cushion on the couch, because joining us today, we have Football Guys' very own Sigmund Bloom. How you doing, Sig?
Oh, excellent. You know, it's springtime. There's March Madness. Public life is thawing out. I got my first vaccine shot, so everything's looking up.
So speaking of that public life, you have a different location than you had when I first started listening to you. You actually are fairly close to me. I'm very close to New Orleans. I'm on the North Shore here.
Oh,
yeah. So are you, can you tell a little bit about like what brought you to New Orleans and why you love the city? Because I've heard you talk about that and would love for you to convince Matt how great New Orleans is.
how long is the show? How much time do I have? Like, this is what I really want to do a podcast about, not football. You're singing my song here. I first came to New Orleans in 1997 when I was in Austin for UT Law School, and something woke up inside of me that I had never felt before. And then when I left, I went back to sleep. And every time I would come back, it would wake up. It's like a siren song that kept calling me back. And whenever I had a chance a few years back to move anywhere, like I could just pick where we were going to move, it was always going to be New Orleans. And I was just talking about this last night with my wife. The best way I can put it is that New Orleans combines the spirit world and the physical world. It has one foot in each. It's kind of like you can have dream consciousness while you're awake. Everything is so vivid, all the sensations, all the experiences. And it's been tough because public life is so important here. Life is lived out in the streets in New Orleans. And it's hurt what's happened during COVID, but it's starting to come back now. And what I like to say about New Orleans is this: the ordinary is extraordinary. There is no ordinary thing. Everything is something we're celebrating. Every day is worth celebrating. And it's been everything I could have hoped for and more.
Well, I know you appreciate the music here in the city as well, and I know we got some music questions coming up in a little bit that we're going to ask you. But also, you mentioned the life and the life of the city. I mean, it certainly is a city that loves getting out and being around people. And you're 100% right that this has been a difficult year, but we're getting back to some normal. So certainly glad to have you here in the city, and appreciate you being on the show.
My pleasure.
And not only is Sig joining us for the first time, but our very own Tara Roberts is joining us, making her debut on the ViperCast. So, Tara, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys so much. Hope I don't have any technical difficulties on my first time here, but I'm really happy to be joining you guys. Excited, love the show, and I'm just ready to get started with you.
I love that you mentioned the technical difficulties. Before the show even started, I already experienced my mute button again. I had to have Sig kind of tell me, you're on mute. I'm like, oh, crap, here we go again. Every week, at least once a week, I have that mute button clicked in. Luckily, it was before the show this time. Let's kind of talk about draft. I know, Sig, you're big into the draft. We got to do our mandatory football chatter here. Draft season, what have we learned so far? Because there's no combine. Pro days are getting kind of carried away. I know we've kind of talked about this in other places. Pro days are kind of getting carried away. Who are some of these risers? Who are some of these fallers? And can we believe any of the smoke that's going on with these pro days? Like, we're talking, I think Micah Parsons ran a 4.39 for a linebacker, and Jason Awi ran a 4.4, like as an edge rusher at 257 pounds. That's ridiculous. You're on mute.
Matt, you're rubbing off on our guest, and they're having they're on mute.
It's contagious. Penn State Pro Day was quite a show. But going back to the way you phrased it, what have we learned? maybe this year more than other years, we're not learning a lot in the sense that we're not getting all the subterfuge and all the rumors, and this team is interested in this player, and this team could move up for this player. And this is a draft in some ways that's going to be an experiment because some of these players don't have any 2020 tape at all. Some have limited 2020 tape. It's going to probably be franchise by franchise how reluctant they are to take players that haven't been on a football field in a year. So it's going to be a draft without groupthink, which is good in some ways because you're going to have a wider variety of opinions. You're going to have a wider variety of analysis on the draft. But I think we can say with some certainty that there will be 4 quarterbacks in the top half of the first round, if not in the top 7 or 8. I think that you'll see 2 offensive tackles, Rashawn Slater out of Northwestern and Penei Sewell out of Oregon, go in the top 6 or 7. And we may see a team trade up into the top 6 or 7 for a tackle, not a quarterback. It's actually been really quiet on the tackle market in free agency, which makes you wonder. There's some veterans out there like Alejandro Villanueva from the Steelers or Russell Okung, who was most recently with the Panthers, who got paid half of his salary in Bitcoin. That was really smart. Anyway, I don't think anyone's going to give him another contract like that. They're just sitting out there. Maybe these teams are looking at the tackles in this draft, and there's some other good tackles in the first round. And I think bringing it up in terms of the pro days is an excellent way to get introduced to these prospects. Parsons, you brought up, is going to be really interesting because Lance Zierlein, who's one of my favorite draft guys at NFL.com, had him falling all the way to 29th in his latest mock draft. Now, that was before this pro day, although I think Josh Norris, who I'm a huge fan of, he's at Underdog Fantasy now, was the first one I ever heard say, don't count it twice, right? So we knew Parsons was going to be ultra athletic. So the fact that he confirmed that doesn't necessarily move him up, but there are some character questions, which is why Lance had him falling that far. But maybe that makes a team talk themselves into taking him in the top 10 after all. So that's a great storyline to think of. And each one of these players represents a great storyline. That's why I love the draft.
That Micah Parsons character thing is something we haven't heard of since end of last season almost,
right?
If I'm not mistaken. So they've done a very good job. I don't want to say Penn State's good at covering things up, but they've done a very, very good job. But whoopsie doodle. We kind of talk about this off and on. The linebacker position's kind of going the way of the running back position, where you can get good linebackers a little bit later in the drafts, much like a running back. This linebacker class, especially the top end, has a lot of questions. Like, they got some studs. We've got Micah Parsons' character. We've got Nick Bolton in his size, Joke in his size there, Awasu Kormoa. Man, I butcher names left, right, and center. This is fantastic. Like, the elite linebackers have their questions or size questions or character concerns that all kind of go with it. Now, kind of backtracking to the combine never really was for NFL personnel. It was the medical checks. That was kind of their go-to thing.
Yeah.
And listen to Daniel Jeremiah. We're at a level here now with technology where the 40 means absolutely nothing because each of these players is literally being timed every time they touch the ball. So they're actually being timed with that next gen stats, their speed, their football speed, which is the one thing that we're all looking for. Do we see the combine will never go away because the NFL is making their money off the combine and the underwear Olympics, if I may. Do you see this changing the way we look at things with this COVID as far as scouting goes?
Yeah. And Cynthia Freeland, who does a good work, I think, at NFL Network, the data analysis, she had also posted a thread on Twitter about how the 40 time wasn't really that predictive for success as long as it was above a threshold or below a threshold, I guess, because we're talking about lower being better. But this is stuff. So there's, I think, a myth that the NFL they're dinosaurs and they're so slow to catch up and they're way behind the curve. A lot of things that we think we've discovered were actually there all along in the NFL. And the NFL, when I started getting into the draft scene, they would talk about thresholds. And some of them are changing, but, like hand size for quarterbacks or arm length for tackles and things like that. But it changes, and it changes as the game changes. It changes as teams, as coaches do better jobs utilizing players. I think the league has become more of a tell me what he can do instead of what he can't do in terms of a scouting report. But I think absolutely the transmitter data, the RFID data that comes from the shoulder pads and game data, because a lot of people would watch someone run a 40 and say, well, what does he do in pads? What does he do whenever you're not running in a straight line? And I think that now we're getting data about top acceleration and top speed. and seeing things that I think will replace those numbers. So the question is, will we have access to those numbers? The way we have access to pro day numbers. So I think a lot of people that have prospect models where they plug in all the numbers and they have filters, maybe that's going to take a step back while we wait for availability. But I think the NFL's probably been using these numbers all along.
So speaking of those numbers, Sig, I've listened to you long enough to know that you have no problem believing in something that you haven't seen or has been seen rarely. I'm old enough to remember you talking about Randy Moss being able to repeat back in 2007, or Chris Johnson being able to repeat after he put up, his crazy numbers. There's a couple of outliers in this draft too that people are doubting based on their measurements and their numbers. So 170 pounds. Has been a number mentioned, and 5'7" has been a number that's mentioned there for a couple of prospects. For Bateman and for Devonta, like, are you? How do you feel about their prospects as outliers in that sense? And are you putting that same faith that you've had in something you haven't seen before in those guys?
Yeah, I think that we can start asking more subtle or nuanced questions about these prospects, right? But Devonta Smith, you're referring to 170 pounds. There's enough success stories. So let me put it this way. If there's an outlier in the sense of, okay, how many wide receivers have made it in the NFL at 170 pounds? Let's look at the players that have made it. So, for instance, someone like Marvin Harrison with a thin frame, and then ask, does this outlier, in this case Smith, have some of the same qualities that allowed Harrison's thin frame to never be a problem? And the answer is yes. Yeah, Smith is extremely polished. He's going to make an immediate impact. He can work inside and outside. He's a tremendous route runner. He's tremendous after the catch. Really, the only thing that's keeping him from being the number one prospect in this class is that he's not a true burner. If he could run like a 4.35, he might be the number one prospect in this class. So I'm not worried about him at all. Now, on the 5'7" front, we're talking about Rondell Moore out of Purdue, who just had a spectacular pro day. So this is where I would get into more of the nuanced questions. I think we've seen now, I know my colleague Matt Waldman brought the name Tavon Austin, right? And Tavon Austin might be a player that you point at and say, this kind of player who you're not necessarily going to have, ice skating and carving these great routes and winning with technique and winning with precision. A player who's used to winning with his suddenness, his quickness, his acceleration, with the ball in his hands, a weapon, if you will. Tavon Austin is cited as, well, that player is overdrafted. That kind of player isn't going to translate when they're that small. But Matt brought it up in the context of, well, was he used correctly? So if you look at Tavon Austin and say, if he would have been used differently, he still could have done something, then I think we just have to ask, as long as Rondell Moore is used in a way that embraces his skill set, then he'll be fine. And perhaps if he fails, it's not because he's 5'7", it's because the team that drafts him didn't understand the best way to use him. I know a name like Percy Harvin comes up. I mean, the point is now with the NFL spreading out, what did we always hear, guys, like 10 or 15 years ago? That's a college player. That's someone who can do those things in college. That's a college offense, right? Now we don't say that anymore because the NFL offenses and the college offenses are merging. And I think that's a really good sign that Rondell Moore is going to be okay. And if he fails, it'll be because of injuries. He's played like 7 games in the last 2 years. So that's, I think, the bigger worry for teams that are pausing before taking him than his height.
So I think we've now reached the end of our contractual obligations to talk football, and now we can talk about some of the fun stuff. So you mentioned music earlier, and I know music is certainly something that I've heard you talk about a lot and is important to you. But what is the one music that says Sigmund Bloom? So if you are a closer coming out in the 9th inning, or if you're a wrestler coming out to the ring, what's that intro music that really hits those chords that introduces you the right way?
Man, I'm kind of a laid back guy, right? So I can't even imagine like what would be like my pump up music. I do want to tell you all though, I was going to ask you like what the origin of the name Dynasty Vipers are. Just because down here in New Orleans, a Viper might have a different connotation. I just tell people out there to look up the song When You're a Viper. It's a classic. It's a New Orleans standard, When You're a Viper. Anyway, kind of on that note, the song that popped into my head is a song by Thundercat, who's the best bassist on the planet right now. He in Flying Lotus, Alex Coltrane's nephew, I think, just won a Grammy. Anyway, he had a song called Lotus and the John D. And that's a song about flying Lotus. And John D is Austin Peralta, who's one of the greatest keyboard players who most people haven't heard of because he died when he was like 21. He's Stacy Peralta's son. Stacy Peralta from Powell Peralta Trucks, if you're a skateboarder or if you saw like Dogtown and Z-Boys. So from that whole bloodline, he was incredible. And one of the best keyboard players of this generation. And it's a song about, let's just say, an adventure, a pharmaceutically enhanced adventure that the three of them had. And it kind of conveys the frenetic chaos of that kind of adventure.
Oh, Matt, you're on mute again.
Sounds like you got some fans here there, because now you got Jeff Bell there going out there and Googling Thundercats for you. So he's definitely taking a look at it right now. So that's a band I'm not familiar with, so I'm probably going to have to take a look at that as well. Yeah. I'm kind of old. Like, we're talking any music from the 70s and 80s, anything beyond that, like maybe early 90s, I might recognize, but I'm an old soul here, so anything new, I definitely have to Google it.
I'm with you. Look, when I do my Peloton rides, if you're out there, I'll do a great endorsement for you. I'm always listening to like 70s rock, classic rock. Although classic rock's like 90s now. Like when I put on classic rock, it's songs from the 90s. So I'm old too, and I definitely have a soft spot for old music. And I'm lucky that new music finds me because of nice people like some of the people in the chat room.
Yeah, I kind of have to echo here, Bob. Thundercats was a great show as a kid. So that's where my mind went right when you said Thundercat. So we're going to play some Thundercat over in Indianapolis. We're going to get that music blaring. We're going to get the Football Guys team out there. We're going to move your retreat from Vegas. We're going to move it to Indianapolis.
Okay.
We're having a Football Guys combine. How is this going to shape up? Gene's going to be right there the whole time. So don't worry about pulling a hammy. You got your Gene. He's going to be there. How is this all going to shape out? How's the Football Guys combine going to go? I don't want to know what you guys look like in your tighties and stuff like that. Sure. That's probably not for this show. But how's it going to shape? We've talked to Jeff. We've talked to a few other guys there. They kind of said, this guy's going to perform well. This guy's going to perform well. Who's going to win this combine? Who are scouts going to come away saying, there's our player? That's who we want.
Oh, probably one of our newest additions, Troy King, because we're old. We skew old too. And luckily we've had a shot in the arm and infusion of younger new talent. I know that he's part of, I think is it hashtag FFFit or FF Fitness, which is something I need. Like, I'm just trying to dig out of my extra football 15 that became like a football 40 during COVID. So I'm just trying to get back to like not being unhealthy. But you brought up Dr. Gene, and the very first thing that popped into my head was we're all going to get hurt. Like we're all going to need medical attention at the end. But actually, folks, Cecil and I and my good friend Mark Folletti, who was the director producer, did a internet shorts show back in 2008, 2009 called Draft Guys TV. And there's an episode out there, and I think you can still find it, called The World's Worst Workout. And we went and hung out with Travell Gaines, who's one of the primo trainers. If you're a professional football player, Travell Gaines is on your short list of people you want to be training with. And we went and we met at that. That was when we met Marshawn Lynch, but that was kind of off the camera, off the record. But I'm trying to think of some of the players that were there. Stevie Johnson was there. Jamel McClain was there. And we did a workout just on a lark. He said, would you guys like to do like one of the combine workouts, Cecil and I? Okay. And it's embarrassing, but it's very entertaining. It was the most popular episode of the show. And let's just say that we were doing everything he was telling us to do, and I was exhausted. And he said, okay, the warm-up's over. Let's get to the workout. And I just, what? And that was 15 years ago or 13 years ago. So I would probably need, again, medical attention. Keep the ambulance in the driveway if I try to do that again.
Well, I'm pretty sure the group here in this room right now, if we did something, 3 of us would be tapping out, and there'd be only one person left standing. And I'm pretty confident it'd be Tara would be the only one left standing after the workout, because the rest of us just can't do that.
Well, kind of on a similar subject, can you tell us about the importance of sports growing up to you, when you were growing up and now? What did you play? Who were your favorite teams and players?
Yeah. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. Well, when I was like 2 to 7 years old, I lived in New Mexico. But I identify with the Pittsburgh teams, and especially the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, that's just a religion there. Although I also got to watch the Mario Lemieux Penguins rise, the very short last outburst of the Pittsburgh Pirates as an actual Major League Baseball team. And then I went to Syracuse University. So Syracuse basketball tomorrow night should be fun. That's close to my heart. But really, sports is something I've always been immersed in, whether it was collecting cards, watching games, going out into the driveway and pretending you were Larry Bird or Magic Johnson or whoever. It was just, and still to this day, I feel like March Madness, right? Sports, I think, is one of the last outposts of the true American dream, where if you work hard enough and you're dedicated and you're committed, you can make it no matter where you start. And I also feel like sports, especially an event like March Madness, remind us that anything can happen. Anything can happen, right? I mean, when it's a human being competition, nothing is finished until it's finished, right? Until there's 3 zeros on the scoreboard. And I feel like it is the most raw emotion that we get in our lives, right? Like as you go through your life, you don't have time to stop and celebrate and do a touchdown dance. And you don't have time to like hang your head and mourn a loss. Life just moves too fast, especially modern American life. It just moves too fast. But sports are a safe area where you can express yourself. And maybe you're screaming and yelling because your team won or lost, but really there's a lot pent up inside that you get out through your affiliation with your sports team. I think that it's almost essential for emotional health to have that release. And it's a way that people come together. It's a way that people have shared experience like mass consciousness. Even last night was my 8-year-old stepson's baseball game, Little League Baseball, which is kind of, cue the Football Follies music. I mean, it's not exactly like the cleanest game, but everybody gets really caught up in it. Well, you know what I'm talking about, man, like living down here, like North Shore, whatever, New Orleans area, like Mardi Gras, right? Like everybody gets so caught up in Mardi Gras. It's worthless Chinese beads. But it's me. And it allows you to work it through your system. And I think sports is more important than ever. I think it's the one thing that people watch and care about on live TV. I think the powers that be know that sports continues to be something that has a sway. It was the thing that everybody cared about, that kind of marked the beginning of public life's going to change during the pandemic when all the sports stopped. I think that was when people said, whoa, this is serious. So obviously I could go on about it, but I think it's wonderful because the whole podcast ecosystem has given us so many ways to connect with each other over our love of sports.
I don't know about you guys, but I know when I'm at work, I'll grab my water bottle. I pull out a couple Gronk spikes a week on it. Yeah. I just walk down the hallways and it's a smash instantly. Yeah. But I love how you mentioned I'm a hockey fan here. So Stanley Cup playoffs have always had that special allure to me. There's something different about that, battling 16 games to get to that championship. I'm not a basketball guy, but I will tune into March Madness every year because of how pure that is at that time. Those emotions that those kids are going through, there's nothing like it. And when you see a 15 seed knock off a number 2 seed, you've seen something special. Yeah. And it's got that. I remember, oh man, I can't remember the team. Was it Valparaiso? Drew was the shooter. When that happened, like could you imagine Twitter actually being around for something like that? I don't even think Twitter was around back then. Or Jimmy V and that NC State rush. Could you imagine what Twitter would have done at that time? Like it's crazy to me. And you're right, sports has that special tie in everyone's lives. And the pandemic, thank God we got our sports back, because could you imagine being isolated without that release at some point? So
the Valvano team was when I fell in love with sports, really. And that was in New Mexico. It was in Albuquerque at the pit. And it really still stands for this idea. Like, I encourage folks to, if you haven't seen it, Survive in Advance is the 30 for 30 that did it on it. It was truly impossible. I mean, it's something that I think everybody would have said was absolutely impossible. And they made it possible. And in our lives, I mean, look, folks, you all gave me the opportunity to talk about things other than sports, right? I mean, there's a lot of injustice in the world. There's a lot of suffering in the world. There's a lot of cruelty in the world. There's a lot of things in the world that make me lose your hope or lose your optimism about humanity. And you don't see a 15 seed beat a 2 seed out in real life very often, right? And then that's why it's so important to see those stories unfold, because it does allow us to continue to push back against oppression, push back against the longest odds, because you never give up. You never stop fighting. You never know what's going to happen.
That's such a good point. And kind of then tying that back into fantasy sports as well. So we know about your favorite team now, Pittsburgh. I've got an uncle who's a diehard Pittsburgh fan, and I know you guys are diehard. He's every single Sunday during the fall in his kitchen cooking in his Pittsburgh Steelers crock pot. So it's like a religion to him. But to tie it back into fantasy, tell us about your what do you remember about your first fantasy league? Was it football? Was it something else? I know my first was actually, oddly enough, baseball. What sport was it? Who invited you? Just tell us about it.
Yeah, the first league, I'm making air quotes when I say that I can remember is me and two of my friends, Albert Morgan and Jim Sirianni, at lunch in high school. We just had a 3-person fantasy hockey league where we picked our players for the week, and we would sit there and tally up like goals, assists, penalty minutes, plus minus, and see who had the best team of the week. Then when I got to Syracuse University, which is where I like to say you can't swing a dead cat without hitting somebody from Syracuse in football media. Like, it's lousy with Syracuse people. It's all because of Bob Costas, I think. And there was a fantasy baseball league that we did, an 8-person league. But really, fantasy didn't become a big part of my life until I had an office job. And I was sitting at a computer all day at the University of Texas starting in 2000. And there were 8 of us that we had a fantasy football league, and then in the spring we had a fantasy baseball league, and it was very much about something for us to do, kind of something for us to annoy everybody else in the office, because we wouldn't stop talking about it, because we'd stay after work and do the draft in the conference room and things like that, and they'd see like our stuff on the chalkboard. It was a way for us to connect with each other. And I really do think that fantasy sports, I hear about it all the time, like leagues that are people that went to high school together or college together or grew up together or were at a workplace together, and then they keep their league together because it's how they stay in each other's lives, and it's the excuse to stay connected. And again, now more than ever, that is important. It boggles my mind that it has become as big as it is. But I think there's something there that it's a human need that is met. I don't think it's strictly about how much people love the sport. I don't think it's about people trying to show how smart they are or how much better they are at predicting things. I think it's just a way for us to continue to have connections to each other.
And that human element, we start getting passionate about our fantasy leagues or about the NFL or whatever it is. And then at some point, you and a few of your friends decided you were going to start talking and go ahead and put it out into the public. And the Audible at some point was birthed. And then at some point you decided, like, you've got a couch in your house that's not being used and you might as well use that too. So tell us a little bit about the origin of the Audible. And then I know later when the couch came along, what was the origin of those stories like?
Well, I can't talk about the Audible without talking about my co-host Cecil Lammy. And Cecil had such a refreshing, uplifting outlook on things. Cecil is a person that subscribes to the idea, try it, do it. He'll say, if you don't ask, the answer is going to be no anyway, so ask, right? He joined Football Guys, I think, about a year before I did as a staffer, and we were both geeked out on the draft. And whenever the draft in 2006 happened, we talked on the phone after the draft for like 3 hours. And he said, do you want to do this again, but record it? I said, okay. And it was actually recorded, like putting the handset next to a tape recorder. I mean, this is low tech. I don't even know if there was a word podcast at that time, but we loved it. And I think that we like the sound of our own voices. When I was a kid, I would walk around with a tape recorder and interview the people in my house like they were on my radio show. I think that for everybody out there, like if you're adrift in life and you're not sure what to do, go back to when you were a kid and think about what you pretended you were when you were a kid, because you probably knew all the way back then what your destiny was or what the place in the world that would complete the circuit for you is. And we forget because, all kinds of different reasons we forget.
Yeah. Space Cowboy never materialized for me.
There's still time. And the Audible kind of just started from that. Now on the couch was something where a lot of people had encouraged me, like, why don't you host a show yourself? And on the couch, I think was just a nod. The title is just a nod to my name, to Sigmund, and the idea of the cerebral psychological layer that's in fantasy football. But really what it was about for me is that the fantasy football space, say for the 2000s, for the first 10 years of this century, was really like everybody had their own little walled garden, and you only talked about what was in your garden, right? It was like no other site existed, no other service existed. You were just there to promote your site and your product, your brand. And I wanted to start a show to highlight how great everybody was. And now it's just standard. Look, I'm not trying to take credit. I have delusions of grandeur, but I'll keep those for another show. But I think I wanted to break down those walls between everybody and say we can, and it happened to coincide with DFS rising and a lot of money coming into the space. So I think that the table got bigger and bigger and bigger to where there's enough room for everybody at the table. And fantasy football and the fantasy, I can't really speak to fantasy basketball and fantasy baseball, but fantasy football and the fantasy football Twitter community, or the community as it's represented on Twitter, is just one of the most positive places. I mean, people really genuinely root for each other. People genuinely appreciate each other. And we don't see each other as competitors or people that, well, if you're getting that customer, then that's one I lost or something like that. We all just want to be able to do what we do and do it for the enjoyment. I was talking about this with Matt before we went on the air, that Football Guys, I think one of the things that ties all the staffers of Football Guys together is, first and foremost, we just love doing the work. We love the sport. We love engaging. And then everything that comes after that is secondary. So I've really enjoyed getting to know everybody in the industry. People have been very gracious with their time. And I feel like, hey, if you show me what's good, even if it's not something at your site, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to think you know what you're talking about. And there's a lot of people and a lot of work that's really good in our space. Uh-oh.
Hey, Matt.
Again.
That's like 3 times in one show, or 2 in one show, but once before the show. We're on record pace here today. But that community, you mentioned that community there, and it's been fantastic. Like, there's a lot of toxic stuff, but there's a lot of toxic stuff anywhere you go. And I used to always find when there's a charity league that comes up or a cause that comes up, how the community rallies, especially on the Twitter end of things. I don't know about Facebook. I don't know about Reddit. Those aren't really my strengths yet. Actually, I'm probably never going to Facebook. Let's be honest. Yeah. That's just like Lindsay Lohan and Mean Girls type thing on Facebook. So we kind of touched on this. The next couple of questions are going to talk about that fantasy league aspect of your career here. And everyone has that league, that go-to league, whether that's baseball or football. You mentioned your 3 buddies doing your fantasy hockey league, but is there that one house league that just has that special place for you? Is it a Football Guys ongoing Dynasty league that you guys drafted back in 1998 that's still ongoing? Is there that one league that if you had to give up everything else but get to keep one league, what's that one league?
The first one that pops into my head is one that one of my good friends, Uriah Zane Hunt, who he has a terrific Detroit-style pizza chain, via 313. I got to give him a plug. He started a league 10 years ago, I think. And look, the bottom line here is these are the kind of leagues that I like. There's 16 teams, 53 man rosters. You start a whole defense. You start, like 3 flexes on top of the typical 2 running backs, 3 receivers, and tight end. The scoring is so that every position is about as important as every other position, right? Like, Hassan Reddick might have put up, I remember, what did he have, like 5 or 6 sacks in one game last year? Like, that's like a 60 or 70 point game, right? So everybody matters. Every position matters. And it's really just comes back to football and who you believe in and who you think is a good football player, and not trying to find ways to game the way the scoring is distributed or the draft and draft this position in this round and this position in this round. So I like it because it takes me all the way back to caring about everybody and everything in the game, and caring about everybody on the roster. Because really that's the best, right? Is when you're the first person to see that some a UDFA in August in camp is turning heads and has a chance to make the roster, and you get that player first, and ends up being James Robinson, right? And changes your whole season. And like those are those like the shot that blows up the Death Star kind of moments, and only in those very deep leagues can you have those.
Yeah, I love that actually. So I exclusively did redraft before this prior season and then dove into Dynasty. And you're right, it's just an entirely different feeling. I'm drafting people, and it feels like my players, adding them to my roster. It just gives you a different feel. And I had another question, but I think you kind of tied everything in and answered it. But I'll go ahead anyway. What's your favorite format for fantasy sports? Do you really lean towards IDP, Dynasty, redraft, keepers? What's your favorite thing to do?
Yeah, I love that. I'll even add a layer to it, like the 16-team, 53-man roster. And I don't have time now to play leagues like this, but the ones with the salary cap and contracts, because it really simulates being a GM, right? Isn't that what brought us all into fantasy football? Because you don't really do coaching in fantasy football. I guess the coaching you have is your lineup setting, which is an underrated fantasy football skill. Don't get me wrong. But being a GM and calling the shots, that's what draws us into fantasy football. This idea that that's the fantasy in fantasy football, right? The fantasy is you're a GM. You get to run a team. You get to call the shots. And I think that the salary cap and contract aspect, although it takes more time and management, like, hey, everybody send that fruit basket to your commissioner right now, because without them, we wouldn't have fantasy football, because they care. And I was a terrible commissioner the one time I tried it. By the way, I was too soft. She would say, "Well, I didn't set my lineup. Can you just go ahead and swap in this player? I meant to, but," and I would do it, and then everyone else in the league would say, "You can't do that," and then I would take the player out, and then and then that person would say, "But that's not fair. You told me you would do it," and basically, I would make everybody hate me. It was not a good idea. Anyway, so the thing about salary cap contract leagues is you can either look really smart and sign somebody to a really cheap contract long term, or as long as it's set up so that, just like in the NFL, there's dead cap. If you move on from a player before the contract is over, it accelerates the hit, and it really limits what you can do that year. There's pain, right? Like if you make a bad pick in a regular league or a typical Dynasty league, you just drop the player and move on. In the salary cap Dynasty league, with the contracts, you're going to pause, you're going to think about it, and it brings in that high wire act part of it where things can go really bad really fast.
Yeah, and I've been in some baseball leagues like that, but now for the first time I'm in Ryan's kitchen sink league, and it is exactly that. Like, you feel like you're a GM, and there's a lot of moving parts, and you get franchise tags, and it really is, like when I was a kid, I was the guy that when I played Madden football, like I would love the draft, want to sign free agents, and I would just sim the season. And my brother was always like, "Why don't you play the games?" I'm like, "This is playing the game for me."
Game.
Yeah, like I love this part. But at some point, like we love what we love, and we get into that. But let's envision this other universe where Sigmund Bloom never gets bit by the fantasy football bug, that the fantasy sports never become a part of your life. And if that never happens, what is Sigmund Bloom doing today?
I don't know. It's kind of a scary thing to ponder. Look, I'll say this. When I was a kid growing up, my two dreams were to be the play-by-play announcer for the Pirates, which this is close enough. I mean, my job is to get to talk and write about sports. Lucky me. And the other was to start the revolution. And I was really, I got soured on broadcast journalism pretty early at Syracuse. It just wasn't my scene. And the jobs paid terribly, and you were going to have to live in, I hate it because if people are from these places, it makes it sound like, if I say Fargo, North Dakota or something like that. But the point is, you'd have to work for 10 years at some job you didn't really want to have a chance to get the job you wanted. So I veered off of that and went into philosophy, and then went into making social change and learning about things. What's wild is this is the mid-90s. Now a lot of the things we talked about in classes that I had about critical race theory or feminism or Marxism and things like that are in the vernacular. We're having these discussions in the public square now. And then I went to law school, and that broke my spirit. And because it was like the game was fixed. You know, when you go to a law school, you learn the game is actually fixed. And I just didn't want to become an angry person and a crusader. I didn't want to give up my own selfish. I didn't want to give up my own peace of mind, peace, truly peace. Because if you focus on all that injustice, all that cruelty in the world, it can really consume you. You become a martyr, basically. You give yourself up for the cause. That being said, you know, I think I would probably be drawn back into that world. The other thing is, I mean, you know, I am an attorney, licensed attorney. I don't know what I could have or would have done, but when I quit my job at UT as a systems analyst to try to make it full-time as some sort of football talker and writer, I didn't really have a plan, but I just wanted to try. There's a long story there about a drunk driver and a friend getting hit by a car and dying, and I woke up in the hospital. Anyway, that I thought, well, really, I'm just tricking myself into being a lawyer because I have a bar card. You know, I passed the bar. I have a law degree. Why am I not practicing law? So this is going to fail because you can't actually, this is 2007. You can't actually make a living as a fantasy football analyst. There's no such job as a fantasy football analyst. So this is a way to trick myself into forcing myself to being an attorney. So I don't know. I tried to be a criminal defense attorney for a few months, and I believed everything my clients told me, which is not a good thing if you're a criminal defense attorney. But I might have found a niche there. But the funny thing is when I talk to people that went to law school, because a lot of lawyers are miserable people. I mean, it's a profession. If someone was coming to me now and saying, should I go to law school? Chances are the answer is going to be no. When I see people, you know, 20 years later, and they say, what are you doing? And I say, fantasy football analyst. They say, that was a choice? That was an option? If I would have known that, maybe I wouldn't have become a lawyer.
It's funny that you echo that. We had Mark Schofield on earlier in the same series.
Love Mark.
And he echoed pretty much the same thing. He said that he really hated his life. And if it wasn't for that career change, and luckily for him, his wife was in a position that allowed him to make that transition. He doesn't know where he would be because of the way that whole toxic environment was kind of bringing him down with it. So I did some research here, Sig, and I'm kind of interested that you went to criminal law because I would have thought you'd have been some kind of drug mule or cattle rustler because I heard a story about you smuggling brisket through airport security. Can you tell us about this? Because this sounds like a fantastic story. How do you, and it wasn't like a small brisket. This was a big brisket. By the way, they loved the brisket. It was fantastic brisket, maybe the best brisket ever. But how did you smuggle brisket through airport security?
Yeah, well, let's just say it's an acquired talent to you just really you have to just not give off any signs that there's anything out of the ordinary about what you're doing. But what you're referring to is, you know, one of our Football Guys retreats was in Las Vegas, and I was living in Austin at the time. And if you know Austin, then you know Franklin Barbecue, and it is that good, by the way. There are certain things, like it's why everyone says go to Cafe Du Monde when you come to New Orleans, because sitting in Cafe Du Monde down on Decatur and having some beignets and cafe au lait and just watching New Orleans around you is one of the, like, it's a bucket list experience. Like do it. And Franklin brisket's like that too. Franklin barbecue brisket. You might wait. I don't even know now, like 3 or 4 hours if you're going to get it. But what people don't know is that you can actually order a brisket ahead of time and like specify the date you're going to pick it up, and then you just like submerge it in boiling water in the little plastic for a while, and it just comes back to life, and it's beautiful and it's wonderful. So you had a 5 or 6 pound brisket in my suitcase, and I was just happy that it wasn't confiscated because, you know, the TSA, I mean, they might want that brisket. I would want that brisket if I saw it. So it absolutely, you know, I guess it was probably the will of wanting to share that with everybody that allowed me to do that. And that's all that was in, I promise, that's all that was in my suitcase that I was smuggling. It was just a brisket. If you hear anything else, that story's not true.
So, like, did you have to go past like drug sniffing dogs with this thing? Like, did you have to put it on the conveyor belt and have it go through for them to inspect?
Yeah,
there's this big brisket in there.
I had to declare it. Yeah, basically, they're like, "Whoa, what's that?" And they joked about taking it. They joked about like, "Well, we can't really," because actually, when I was just flying back from Albuquerque, I love my New Mexican food, and I was bringing back these jars of green chili from And the security, they said, no, you can't take this. I'm like, come on, you're New Mexico. So I think that it was really just making sure that they knew that everything was, explained about the retreat. So I think the biggest obstacle was having them not confiscate it, just because, I mean, if you have a chance to have like a 5 or 6 pound Franklin brisket under any pretense at all, you're going to figure out a way to take that brisket home with you.
Yeah, I'm from Houston. Sorry, I got a little distracted when you mentioned beignets and Cafe du Monde, because anytime I can get to New Orleans, that's something that I have to have. It's like highlight of my life. So yeah, but to kind of get back to fantasy sports and your role and your job, at what point did you decide that you wanted fantasy sports to be more than just a hobby for you?
Well, it was very simple, actually. I was lucky at UT I was an attorney that didn't want to be an attorney. So UT had a program, this is during the .com boom, where actually at UT, they trained their own systems analysts in their own language. Well, it wasn't their own, it was like a German database language. But they thought if you can talk to people, if you have good people skills and language skills, give them 6 months and they can teach you all the coding part, because they felt like people that were coding aces couldn't necessarily work with the business layer to the university and give quality support. So I was really lucky to basically have a brand new career start. But the reality was I was good at ideas. I was good at relating with the clients. I was not detail oriented. I was not really a good coder. I would get bored. And I'm a starter. I'm not necessarily a finisher when it comes to big projects. And I was languishing. And I found that I spent more time, I'm sorry if any of my bosses from UT back then are listening. I spent more time managing my fantasy teams than I did doing my work. And the light bulb came on. Well, why don't you try to make that what you do as your work? And I was just lucky because people hadn't really thought of it as something that was going to become so big that it could be your job. And I think that's part of the reason that I get to do this, because I just took the risk early. So if there's anything out of my story that I would relate to people, is if you take a risk before everybody realizes that it's something that's going to work, then that alone can be the reason that you're successful.
I love that too, because you talk about this making that transition from the job, and I'm going to use my big word calendar here. You've done the Audible for an insane amount of podcasts. I can't remember when, was it 300 or
4,000? We just hit 4,000.
4,000 podcasts. Are you kidding me? So I'm really I've got my word calendar here. To the best of your recollection. Recollection.
Good.
That's like a 4-syllable word. That I just taught myself for the day. What is the most memorable podcast over that 4,000 episode stretch? Wow. Is there one that just stands out to you more than anything else?
Wow. Oh man, there's dozens of things just rush into my head all at once. For me, so we started in 2007 when the Audible's really rolling. We started inviting beat writers on to the show, and fantasy football was still, I called it like the children's table. We wouldn't even mention fantasy football. If these beat writers who were real working reporters in the NFL were taking time to let us interview them for 10 or 12 minutes, we might ask them what's going on with the backup running back depth chart battle, but we would never say anything about fantasy football. And I want to mention that our first ever beat writer was Tom Killer Kowalski, who passed away, I don't know how long ago it is now, but he was covered the Lions. And anybody who's into the Lions, if you say Killer Kowalski, they're going to know exactly who you're talking about. But for me personally, it was Ed Bouchette, who's been covering the Steelers since I could open up a newspaper and get my fingers dirty reading, because that's all there was back in the day. Like, you just read the newspaper, maybe watched the few minutes on the nightly news, ESPN Sports Center. And getting to talk to somebody who was really my eyes and ears for my Steelers, and being a peer to that person was really fantastic. And I think that there's a lot of things about doing the show that really helped me get over. Because look, one of the things I still don't understand, like, why I'm a big deal or why people would want to have me on their show, but I'm glad they do because I like talking about this stuff, like meeting people, and people say they're nervous because I'm on the show, right? But I was so nervous for like the first 2 or 3 years that I was doing podcasts. Always so nervous. And that getting to do that show with Ed Bouchette, having it go well, like what a show should go like, was a big way for me to feel like, okay, I can do this. We can do this. We just had Ed Bouchette on the show, and it was a good show. So that's one that I remember for sure.
Yeah. Hey, man, how's it going?
Major.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
Awesome. So what if some of the things you learned through fantasy football? I know you got your hands in a lot of different things. Can you kind of give us some of that insight? Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I like to say about fantasy football is we can be right and wrong in the same season, in the same month, even in the same game. You can say this player is going to be a hit because of how he's going to fit with his quarterback, and someone else can say this player is going to be a bust because he can't stay healthy, and that can happen in the same game. And I think that it humbles you. Look, we pretend we can predict the future. I'm going to be very specific about this. Like, we all pretend we can predict the future. We can't. But it's fun to pretend that we can. So I think it just keeps you humble, again, about that idea of what's possible. And also, you have enough times, if you play fantasy football long enough, you'll have times where you really get dug in and feel like, I have a good line on how I think this is going to go. And then after a little while, it's not going that way, and you give up. And then maybe a few weeks or a month later, exactly what you thought was going to happen happens, and you don't get to benefit from it because you gave up too early. I think fantasy football teaches you to be patient, to let things play out over time, instead of instantly reacting to things and missing opportunities.
Perfect.
Yeah, I don't know how many times I've rostered a guy for 12 weeks where he's done absolutely nothing. And then you're like, you know what? I'm done. Throw it away, put him back on the waiver wire. Back in the day, just about a year ago, kids were going around taking ice cream containers out of freezers, licking them, putting them back in the freezer. That's kind of what I started doing with some players. I put them back in the freezer just to have them go off like the week after. Callum Balaj last year is another good example. I rostered him for 2 straight years, waiting for him to do something. The second I drop him, he gets picked up. The guy starts him, and he goes off that week. And you know what? There's very few jobs or positions out there where you can be wrong and get away with it. I think about the weatherman being a pretty good example of it. But yeah, I totally feel you on this one because you can be right and wrong, and in the same season altogether. So
awesome. Can we talk about relationships for a second? Before we went live, Cal mentioned that I actually met these guys through Clubhouse. Clubhouse rooms. We're just casually talking about fantasy football, having open chats, and just being able to form relationships with them. And I was wondering if you could tell us about those relationships that you've had along the way, and people that you respect and that have helped you along the way.
Yeah, I think that that's actually what's happening, right? It's funny, the show Lost. It's one of those things that hits a nerve. As soon as someone mentions Lost, I'll start ranting. My blood pressure probably goes up. But the joke it was about the friends we made, right? Like, that was the joke of like how they tied it all up. It was really about the friends we made all along. But it is. It actually is. And the NFL is not any different. It is about relationships. And I think that podcasting has gotten so huge because the sound of another person's voice talking to you is comforting. Right? Like getting read a bedtime story when you were a kid. It's human. The vibration of someone's voice is unique, and what they use to express it is also unique. And it's a way in this world that continues to isolate us from each other to connect back to each other. And I can't even begin to talk about all the people that are in my life. Like, I'm about to go up to Michigan for a week. Bob Henry, who predates me at Football Guys, he's a true OG, and his friend Lang are people like I can see them and feel like I've known them my whole life. And what's beautiful about this is that through this community, like, a lot of us can go anywhere in the country and there'll be someone there that we know, right? There'll be somebody there that's like, you want to get a drink or coffee or lunch or something. And people will often say to me, I feel like I know you, even though you don't know me, which in some ways just helps. I mean, so this is where I'm going to really go off on tangents. Watch out. Well, look, dudes, guys, like we are generally socialized to not be like touchy-feely with each other, right? Like it's kind of awkward, right? Like it's making a friend with another dude is kind of awkward. Like I want to be your friend. It's not like we're little kids. We're like, hey, you want to play with me? You know?
Right.
And fantasy football gives us these ways to have introductions and connections in each other's lives that don't have any anxiety or fear or worry attached to it. Because like it's that feeling like, oh, I feel like I already know you. Well, if you've been listening to me and you feel like you already know me and you wanted to like have coffee with me, then I feel comfortable that you like me, that you think I'm okay, that my time is worth it. And I think that removes a lot of obstacles to just continuing to grow your network of people that you feel comfortable with, that you get something positive from, that when you're around them, you're in a better mood than before you were around them. And I think that's what's driving fantasy football. And again, this fantasy football space, you mentioned, Clubhouse, Twitter, the podcast circuit and things like that. It's so unbelievably positive. And I think for a lot of people, it's probably one of the most positive areas of their life. And everybody has a piece of that. And everybody deserves credit for that. And I just feel lucky that that I'm accepted in this world.
So I know I could go off on so many of those tangents with you, but I know we're closing in on an hour here, so I'll pitch this over to you. There are a couple of things that you guys at Football Guys do that are markers for me in the off season, where after the draft you break down every person, including the undrafted free agents, and I love listening to that. And then the preseason show where you break down the teams and what to expect, and you talk about the preseason watch list, right? So those are staples for you guys. Is there anything new that you guys are thinking about this offseason? Are you setting up a TikTok account? Is Cecil going to go on there with you?
Right.
Like, is there anything else that you're doing?
Well, I'm old, so I should be asking y'all, like, what should we be doing? Like Tara, I got a Clubhouse account. I was like, well, I don't know why I have this. I don't know what to do with it. But obviously, folks like yourself do, because there's things happening, and we definitely want to be on the bleeding edge of that. I think it's just a massive infusion of talent. And I wish we could hire like 50 people. But I mentioned Troy King. We've got Dave Kluge. We've got Adam Wild, who's doing a new Dynasty newsletter show with Chris Allen, who we hired last year, who's fantastic. We've just hired Anthony Amico. We've just hired Ben Cummins. I know there are probably people on Pat Fitzmaurice. Oh my! I mean, that's a bigger compliment to us than it is to him. The Football Guys, that he would want to be part of Football Guys. So we have a lot of new people. It's a real exciting time right now at Football Guys because of all these new contributors.
Absolutely. You run down that lineup, and that's a who's lineup there. We had Pat on the show earlier. He's been one of the most humble individuals out there. Right. We tried to get him to gloat. I tried to poke him a little bit about gloating about being the most accurate analyst in all of fantasy sports. And he just kind of shrugged it off and talked about, he was very humble, but that fits your guys' mold over there. It really does. Good people. And that's the key over there, the Football Guys, is just good all around people. And that starts from the top down, from Joe to you to Cecil to Bob Henry, the original members of that whole, I'll call you guys what you are. You're an organization, really. And it comes from the top down. I love what you guys do over there. And like Calvin said, kind of look forward. Like, I don't wake up in the morning without reading that Football Guys newsletter that gets sent out every morning, because I have a very low attention span, and I love to have that little headline every morning. Just give me the head start on the rest of my competition.
Well, it's a great compliment for everybody. Look, I always like to say your time and your attention is the most precious thing you have. And if things that you're willing to give that to, it's a great compliment. So we're happy, and we hope we can continue to provide something that people want to make part of their lives, because it allows you all to be part of our lives, which again circles back to relationships and kind of why we're here.
That's great. So do you have any advice, or can you give us any advice for those of us trying to make it in this industry?
Yeah, and I think this applies to any industry.
Yeah.
Be enthusiastic, be passionate, positive, People are drawn to that. I mean, look, it's just like any other thing. I talk to people that are starting out, and it's just like any other sector, any other endeavor. You're going to look around and you're going to see people getting ahead in ways that makes you think, ugh, that's not me. But it works, right? Or at least it seems to work. From the outside looking in, it looks like being negative or tearing other people down, or using that kind of energy to advance your career, or taking shortcuts, right? Puffery and even just flat out lying about things that you've done. It can get people ahead, and it makes you question what you're doing. But if you are in it, first and foremost, if the work is the reward, right? Doing the work, you enjoy the work, then you don't have to worry about that. You already won. So if you're doing work that you love to do, it's going to show in your work. I don't care what you're doing. I don't care what it is. The love is the secret ingredient, right? There's so many things we say that we just slough off like it's a cliche. But the reason that things become cliches is because we say them a lot. And it's a shorthand way to refer to something that's just a truism. And I think that if there's love in the work and positivity and enthusiasm, and you use it to connect up with that, then that thread, that golden thread, will present itself, and you just follow it. And it's going to lead you to people that you have something to give them and they have something to give you. And you put something in motion that's bigger than you, and you don't worry about where it's leading. Don't worry about when you hit a certain milestone, or makes X amount of money, or have this many people listen to your show, because it will unfold the way it's supposed to, right? If you put something out into the universe, something will come back. You don't necessarily get to decide what that is. It may not be what you were asking for, but something does come back. And I think that if you have that kind of generous attitude, you end up with so much more than you ever could have hoped for, than if you're results oriented. Like, I'm doing this because I want this out of it. And I think that if what you want out of it is just the opportunity to do it, then it makes it real easy to win and let all of that stuff fade away. And sometimes releasing your grasp on those things is what allows you to attain them. And if you grip too hard, then you never will.
Absolutely. I love that. I think everyone here kind of loved that. I was watching the head nodding going on as you were speaking. We're going to send the last word over to you here. Tell everyone where to find you, where they can find your work and this and that. But while you're doing that, please explain to them what your avatar on Twitter actually is.
Oh, yes. I love that. That's, again, a play off of Sigmund the Sea Monster. It was a show in the 70s, a kid show. If you're old enough and you remember Sid and Marty Krofft, there was H.R. Puffin stuff. There was Land of the Lost, which is one of the first genuinely scary things I remember watching when I was a kid. And Sigmund the Sea Monster was a sea monster who got kicked out of the sea monster cave because he wouldn't scare people. So he lived in a tree house with a boy, and he got into all kinds of adventures. And I liked it. And it actually has ended up being, I have no strategy at all in life except just to be me, because that's all I know how to do. But because it stands out so much and people don't know what it is, it catches their eye and it makes them wonder. And that's what people say, are you ever going to change? No, I'm never going to change it. I'm never going to change it. The one thing I do need to do, because down here in New Orleans now where costuming is a big deal, is to get my Sigmund the Sea Monster costume together and just wear that every Mardi Gras day. So, I'm just happy to have the opportunity to join y'all. I think what you're doing here is wonderful. I think that, again, highlighting the human aspect of this is what the real story is, even though we're using fantasy football to be the handshake. And I'm just glad you mentioned some of the people that have been on the show listening to your intro. Again, if I'm in that club, then I feel like that's a validation. It makes me feel like I've done something really good.
Well, we've certainly enjoyed the show here. Anyone else have anything else to add before we get on out of here?
Apologies for being late.
Well,
better late than never.
Yeah, and I'll just say the advice right there. I'll just jump in and say, there's no way you remember this, but 7 years ago, you gave me that exact same advice. And
I'm consistent.
Yeah, I had reached out to you about coming on a show that I was doing. So, like, actually, you agreed to come on a show with me like 7 years ago, but then the place that I was working for like shut down, so it wasn't able to come to fruition. But yeah, then in some follow-up emails, that's exactly what you said, and it was such a relief that it's not like, oh, I got to try and earn this or do this or, like you said, reach this milestone. Like, no, like just talking to my friends about fantasy football, whether it's into the phone or whether it's into a microphone, like it's worth it and it's fun and it builds those relationships. And that's been a staple of it relaxed me in a way that has allowed me to, I think, just have fun and enjoy the conversations and enjoy what I'm talking about and just live life free of the burden of this has to produce something that is bigger and out of my control.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that all said, for Calvin, for Tara, for Major, for Sigmund, and Sigmund's alter ego, Sigmund the Sea Monster, I'm Matt Donnelly, and this is the Dynasty Vipers ViperCast. And we gone.